A rich businessman went to court for a deal, but ended up fighting to save 4 hungry little girls from a powerful man's lies. Wait until you see how this shocking true story unfolds and why it will restore your faith in people. Dear friend, what you're about to experience is not just a story. It's a deeply human journey about loss, resilience, and the quiet, unexpected ways love finds us when we need it most. If this is your first time here, I invite you to drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing your voice. And if you're someone who believes in second chances and the hidden strength of ordinary people, and in stories that stay with you long after they end, consider subscribing and tapping the bell icon. We share moments that matter. Thank you for being part of this one. Now, let's begin. He never expected to find them there. The morning began like any other for Ethan Carter, a man whose calendar was booked months in advance, whose time was measured in deals worth millions. That day, he walked into the Los Angeles Superior Court dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit, the kind that whispered power with every stitch. His purpose was simple: sign off on a final agreement that would secure the merger of 2 tech giants, a move that would bring him closer to becoming the most influential investor on the West Coast. He didn't plan on staying longer than 30 minutes. He certainly didn't plan on crying. The courthouse lobby buzzed with controlled chaos. Lawyers rushed past with files bursting at the seams. Uniformed officers stood stoic by the metal detectors, and the scent of burnt coffee mingled with floor wax in the crisp morning air. For Ethan, places like this were just sterile arenas of paperwork and procedure. He barely looked up from his phone as he strode across the gleaming marble floor, his polished shoes clicking with each purposeful step. Time was currency, and he spent it sparingly. But then something tugged at the corner of his vision. He slowed, almost against his will, and turned his gaze toward a wooden bench near courtroom 3. There, huddled together, were 4 little girls. They couldn't have been older than 7. Their clothes were wrinkled, their shoes scuffed, and their cheeks pale beneath tangled brown hair. One girl's eyes caught his huge, glassy, and startlingly blue. They weren't playing, they weren't even fidgeting. They sat perfectly still, their hands folded in their laps like they'd been taught to wait without asking questions. Ethan's heart thudded. He felt the kind of unease money could never soothe. He approached, slowly, wary of scaring them, and crouched to their level. "Sweethearts, are you lost?" His voice sounded foreign in his own ears, gentler than he remembered it could be. The oldest girl looked at him with the haunted calm of a child who had seen too much. She shook her head. "No, sir. We're waiting." For who, he asked, swallowing against the tightness in his chest. "Our mom," she said softly. "She's in court." Another girl piped up, her voice even smaller. "We're hungry." Those words hit Ethan like a slap. Hungry. He glanced around the busy hallway. Dozens of adults in suits passed by, but none seemed to notice the little ones stranded there. He saw their chapped lips, the thinness of their wrists. The ache in his chest deepened. He thought of his own childhood, of his mother scraping together meals after his father left, of nights spent going to bed with an empty belly. He thought he'd buried those memories long ago. A bailiff approached, glancing at Ethan with suspicion. "Something wrong here," Ethan straightened his voice low but firm. "These girls need help. Where is their mother?" The bailiff shrugged. "She's in with Judge Parker, theft case. It's not my business." And with that, he walked off, leaving Ethan seething at the indifference. He knelt again. "How long have you been waiting?" The girls looked at each other. "Since early morning," the eldest whispered. Ethan checked his watch. It was nearly noon. His meeting, his merger, none of it seemed to matter anymore. "Wait here," he said, rising with a determination he hadn't felt in years. He sprinted out of the courthouse, heart pounding faster than it had since he was a boy. 15 minutes later, he returned his arms loaded with bags of sandwiches, juice boxes, and fruit. He handed them to the girls, expecting them to rip into the food. But they surprised him. They opened the bags, carefully sharing bites with solemn precision, making sure the youngest ate first. There was no desperation, only quiet gratitude. Tears pricked his eyes. How could children so small carry so much dignity? "Where's your father?" Ethan asked gently. Silence fell over the bench like a shroud. The oldest girl's eyes dropped. "He's gone," she said finally. Her voice cracked. Ethan's throat burned. He took a shaky breath, blinking back tears he didn't want them to see. A lesson unfolded before him, right there in that courthouse hallway. Sometimes the smallest voices carry the deepest truths. Sometimes in the rush to climb higher, we forget to look down and see who's been left behind. He realized the world had taught these girls not to ask for help, and it shattered something inside him. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from the youngest girl's face. "No one should have to wait this long," he said, his voice trembling. He scanned the crowded corridor. Lawyers, clerks, and officers moved past like ghosts, their eyes fixed anywhere but on these children. How many times had he done the same? How many hungry eyes had he ignored? Ethan straightened, resolve hardening inside him. He knew he couldn't walk away. He needed to find out what had really happened to their mother. The world he thought had given him power and privilege. Now it was time to use it for something other than profit. This wasn't just about charity. It was about justice. As the noise of the courthouse swirled around him, he promised himself he would see this through. He would find Sophie Morales, hear her side of the story, and if she truly was innocent, he would fight with every resource he had. And so, what started as a routine morning for Ethan Carter would become the day everything changed, not just for him, but for 4 little girls who thought the world had forgotten them. As he gathered himself and prepared to step into courtroom 3, Ethan had no idea just how deep this rabbit hole would go, or how many dark secrets waited beyond that heavy wooden door, but he was ready to find out. Ethan Carter stepped into courtroom 3, feeling the cold weight of the air around him. His eyes swept the room, landing on a small figure seated across from the imposing man he immediately recognized as Gerald Brooks. But it was the woman sitting closest to the judge who caught his breath. Sophie Morales. She looked even more fragile in person than he expected. Thin, her brown hair pulled back in a trembling ponytail, her hands clenched in her lap as if they were the only things keeping her together. Her eyes darted nervously each time Gerald's lawyer spoke, as though expecting the next blow to knock her off her feet. Ethan slipped quietly into a back row, trying not to draw attention. He listened as Gerald's lawyer painted a portrait of Sophie as an ungrateful employee who had stolen a luxury watch out of greed. Gerald himself sat tall, confident, his tailored suit immaculate, his expression smooth and unbothered. The prosecutor echoed Gerald's narrative without hesitation. Sophie, they said, had every reason to take the watch, a mountain of unpaid bills, for children, no husband to help. But Ethan could see the truth in Sophie's eyes. She barely looked at Gerald. When she did, it was with a flicker of fear so raw it made Ethan's stomach twist. This wasn't the face of a thief, he thought, but of a woman cornered, desperate to survive. Ethan leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes for a moment, remembering something he once heard in a meeting with a mentor. The most dangerous men are those who look untouchable. He opened his eyes again and studied Gerald's every gesture, the casual arrogance, the faint smirk when Sophie stammered the subtle shake of his head that seemed to say, "You can't beat me." It was a performance Ethan had seen too many times in boardrooms, but it had never looked this cruel. Sophie's voice was so soft the courtroom had to lean in to hear. "I didn't steal it. she said, her words quivering with exhaustion. He started staying late at the restaurant when I cleaned up. He told me I was pretty, that I should go out with him. I said no. Then he got angry. Her voice broke. A few days later, the watch was gone. He said I took it. A hush fell over the room. Even the judge seemed to shift uncomfortably. Ethan's heart clenched at the raw honesty in her words. He glanced at the girls' empty bench outside, picturing them waiting patiently, oblivious to the storm raging inside these walls. He realized then that Sophie's nightmare wasn't just about the missing watch. It was about the power Gerald wielded, the connections he had, and the confidence that no one would question his story. The prosecution tried to chip away at Sophie's credibility, bringing up her overdue rent, the bounced checks, the grocery store debts. Ethan felt the frustration boil in his veins. Of course, she was struggling. She was raising 4 children alone on a minimum wage job. How many women in America were living the same quiet battle, one paycheck away from disaster? He thought of his mother again, how she once pawned her wedding ring, just to keep food on the table. And he knew deep down that if someone like Gerald had chosen to target her back, then she wouldn't have stood a chance either. What Ethan witnessed in that courtroom was bigger than one woman's tragedy. It was the same story that played out for countless other stories where truth drowned under the weight of wealth and influence. The girl's simple plea for food earlier wasn't just a sign of hunger, but a cry for safety, for justice that seemed impossibly far away. The judge called a recess, and Sophie's shoulders slumped as if the air had finally been sucked from her lungs. Ethan moved quickly, stepping forward, just as she gathered her papers with trembling hands. "Sophie Morales," he said softly, his voice breaking the quiet. She looked up, startled, her eyes wide and wary. He introduced himself, explaining how he met her daughters. Her face flushed with shock. Then a flicker of shame crossed her features. You saw them," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't know it would take this long. I thought I'd be back before they got hungry." Ethan gently touched her elbow, steadying her. "They're fine now. I got them something to eat." Tears welled in Sophie's eyes, and she looked away quickly, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm so tired," she whispered so low he almost didn't catch it. "I've tried everything to keep them safe, and I'm losing." At that moment, Ethan saw beyond her weary face. He saw her strength. He saw the sacrifices she had made the nights she probably went hungry, so her children wouldn't the fear that had become her constant companion. And he knew she was telling the truth. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "I believe you, Sophie. I believe every word you said, and I can help." She pulled back slightly, shaking her head. "I can't afford lawyers. I don't want to owe anyone." Ethan met her gaze firmly. "This isn't about owing me. It's about making sure Gerald doesn't do this to someone else." As the courtroom clerk called everyone back to their seats, Sophie hesitated, her eyes darting from the door to Ethan. He reached into his pocket and handed her his card. "Think about it. When you're ready, I'll be here." She clutched the card like a lifeline, her knuckles white. In that instant, Ethan realized how easily this could have stayed invisible. How many people had walked past her and her daughters without a second glance? How many still would? There's a lesson in every quiet plea. He thought sometimes the strongest fight isn't loud. It's silent, happening behind closed doors, in tired eyes and whispered fears. And when we dare to listen, we might find the truth we've been blind to all along. The day after their conversation, Ethan Carter woke before dawn, restless, and unable to shake the image of Sophie Morales' hollow eyes. He knew instinctively that Gerald Brooks would not stay silent now that someone was standing up for Sophie. It was only a matter of time before the man retaliated. Ethan spent the morning calling old contacts, beginning with Martha Collins, a lawyer he trusted more than anyone else in his circle. She specialized in employment and harassment cases and had a reputation for being as fierce as she was compassionate. When he told her about Sophie's story, she didn't hesitate. "Ethan, if everything you're telling me is true, then Gerald's not just a bully, he's a predator, and we're going to need every shred of evidence we can find." Together, they mapped out a plan to gather proof that Sophie had been framed. Ethan called in Derek Vaughn, a discreet private investigator he had once used to vet a business partner. Derek was a man who could slip through shadows and uncover what others wanted hidden. He agreed to start looking into Gerald's past, searching for other women who might have endured the same pattern of flattery, threats, and accusations. But as they moved forward, Gerald struck first. Early that evening, Sophie called Ethan in a panic. Her voice shook so hard it barely sounded like her. "Someone broke into the place I'm staying," she sobbed. "They trashed the living room. The girls are screaming. I don't know what to do." Ethan's blood turned to ice. He told her to pack what she could and stay put until he arrived. When he stepped into the cramped apartment, he found furniture overturned, shards of a broken lamp scattered across the floor, and 4 terrified little girls clinging to their mother. One of them had a small cut on her cheek from falling during the chaos. Ethan took a slow breath, forcing calm into his voice. "Sophie, I'm moving you all somewhere safe. Tonight." He arranged for them to stay in a secure guest house he owned near the beach in Malibu, a place he had always used as a quiet escape. But now it would become their sanctuary. As he drove them there, he glanced in the rearview mirror, seeing the girls huddled together, eyes wide, silent tears slipping down their cheeks. It was a sight that broke him in ways he hadn't expected. Once settled, Ethan hired private security to stand guard around the clock. He couldn't risk Gerald escalating further. Sophie tried to protest, insisting he'd already done too much, but Ethan met her gaze firmly. "This isn't charity, Sophie," he said quietly. "It's what anyone should do when they see someone in danger." She covered her mouth as tears welled up her shoulders, shaking with silent sobs. That night, as the girls finally slept, Sophie and Ethan stood in the kitchen. The room was warm, the soft hum of the ocean drifting through the open windows. Sophie clutched a mug of tea in trembling hands. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "No one's ever done this for us." Ethan's eyes softened. "You don't have to thank me. Just don't give up." Meanwhile, Martha discovered something chilling. An anonymous blog post began circulating online, claiming Sophie had a history of theft at previous jobs, allegations completely fabricated but crafted with enough detail to sound plausible. Rumors spread quickly. The few friends Sophie had started pulling away, and even the girls' teachers began treating them differently. When Sophie learned about the rumors, she collapsed onto the guest house porch, burying her face in her hands. "I'm ruining their lives," she cried, voice hoarse. "Everywhere we go, this will follow us." Ethan knelt beside her, his own eyes glistening. "No, Sophie. Gerald is the one doing this. You're fighting, you're surviving, and you're teaching your girls to stand up for themselves even when it's hard." He reminded her of women who had once faced the same battles, like Anita Hill, who had courageously testified about harassment despite the world doubting her. Real examples of how truth could shatter even the most carefully constructed lies. Derek Vaughn's investigation soon uncovered Gerald's pattern: multiple former female employees who had left abruptly, unexplained settlements, and a quiet string of HR complaints that were buried before they ever reached legal proceedings. But perhaps most damning was the discovery of a threatening message Gerald had sent Sophie weeks earlier, warning her to remember who has the power if she didn't play nice. Martha nearly cried when she read it. "This is the proof we need," she said fiercely. This shows his intent. But Gerald wasn't finished. Just days later, a slickly edited video appeared online, apparently showing Sophie slipping Gerald's watch into her bag. Sophie saw it on her phone first, her face going ashen as her knees buckled. Ethan caught her before she hit the floor. "It's fake," he said urgently. "I swear we'll prove it's fake." He immediately called a digital forensics expert who agreed to analyze the footage and confirmed it had been manipulated using deepfake technology. Gerald had crossed a line few could imagine, turning the very idea of truth into a weapon. Ethan sat awake that night, staring out at the moonlit waves, knowing the battle was only beginning. He thought of his mother again. How different her life might have been if someone had stepped up for her the way he was trying to step up for Sophie. He realized then that the only way to defeat darkness was to drag it into the light. The lesson, he thought as the stars shimmered overhead, was simple, but profound evil often counts on silence. But courage, even quiet courage, can change everything. And with every new piece of evidence, every sleepless night, Ethan was more determined than ever to see this fight through to the end. The morning of the hearing dawned gray and heavy, as if the sky itself understood what was at stake. Ethan Carter stood outside the Santa Monica courthouse with Sophie Morales beside him, her hands trembling as she buttoned her borrowed jacket. She looked like a woman bracing herself for a storm, and in many ways that was exactly what awaited her inside those courthouse doors. Yet there was something new in her eyes, too, a flicker of resolve that hadn't been there weeks earlier, when she'd first thought the world was collapsing on top of her. As they entered the building, reporters crowded near the steps, eager for a glimpse of the woman whose story had begun to capture hearts across the city. Martha Collins, already inside, had arranged for a private room to keep Sophie away from the cameras until it was time to face the judge. Ethan stayed close to her side, offering quiet words of encouragement. "Remember," he said softly, "you're not the one on trial for who you are. Gerald is." In the courtroom, a hush fell as the judge took her seat. Sophie took a deep breath and raised her chin, determined to meet every gaze head-on. Gerald Brooks sat with his high-priced lawyers flanking him, his eyes darting nervously, despite the smug tilt of his mouth. For the first time, Ethan noticed cracks in Gerald's composure sweat at his temples, fingers drumming on the table. The man who had seemed untouchable was starting to feel the walls closing in. Martha stood to deliver opening remarks on Sophie's behalf. Her voice was clear, firm, and compassionate. She laid out the timeline of Gerald's behavior, the threatening message, the sudden accusation of theft, and the deep-fake video that nearly ruined everything. She presented evidence Derek Vaughn had uncovered names of women who had fled Gerald's employment under suspicious circumstances and settlement agreements hushed with non-disclosure clauses. She then called the digital forensics expert who explained in detail how the video had been manipulated. The courtroom listened in rapt silence, the horror of what Gerald had done slowly dawning on every face. Sophie watched each piece of evidence unfold, her eyes wide but unblinking. When the forensics expert confirmed the video was fake, she let out a shuddering sigh, her body seeming to release weeks of tension all at once. Ethan reached over gently, squeezing her hand. He saw tears glisten in her eyes, and he felt his own throat tighten. Then, Gerald's lawyers tried to turn the tide painting Sophie as an opportunist who sought pity and attention. But before the judge could rule on objections, Ethan stood up, surprising everyone. He respectfully asked the court to let him speak as a character witness. The judge considered, then nodded. Ethan walked to the center of the courtroom, straightened his suit jacket, and met the judge's eyes. "My name is Ethan Carter. I've spent decades in boardrooms where people like Gerald Brooks thrive on fear and silence, but I've also seen what happens when someone finally says enough. Sophie Morales didn't ask for this fight. She never wanted to be here. But she's here because she was brave enough to say no to a man who thought his power made him untouchable. He paused, letting the words settle in the hushed room. I've witnessed firsthand the love she has for her daughters, the sacrifices she's made, and the strength she's shown even as everything fell apart around her. If we punish people like Sophie for speaking out, we teach every child watching that the rich and powerful can do as they please. But if we protect her, we show them that truth matters more than money. As Ethan returned to his seat, he caught a glimpse of Gerald's pale face. The man's arrogant posture was gone, replaced by a jittery, sunken stare. Gerald looked around as if searching for an exit, realizing the tide had turned. For the first time, he seemed truly afraid. The judge called for a short recess before announcing her decision. Sophie leaned into Ethan, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what happens next. She admitted, tears streaming down her cheeks. Ethan placed a comforting arm around her shoulders. Whatever happens, he said, voice steady, you won't face it alone. The lesson, Ethan thought as he looked around the courtroom filled with strangers, hanging on every word, was painfully clear. Silence shields cruelty, but courage exposes it. The truth once spoken has a power all its own. And when enough people stand up, even the most formidable walls of injustice can start to crack. As they waited for the judge to return, Sophie wiped her tears and looked at Ethan with something different in her eyes, not just fear or gratitude, but determination. The woman who had walked into that courthouse, burdened by hopelessness, was gone. In her place stood someone who knew her own worth, who was ready to fight for herself and for the daughters who depended on her. The gavel echoed across the silent courtroom as the judge read her decision. Sophie Morales was declared innocent of all charges. The courtroom let out a collective breath, but Sophie herself was frozen, her eyes wide as if she couldn't believe what she'd heard. Then, slowly, relief and disbelief collided on her face as tears spilled freely down her cheeks. Ethan Carter reached for her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. She gripped him tightly as if grounding herself in the reality that it was finally over. But even as Gerald Brooks was escorted out of the courtroom, his career and reputation in shambles, the journey wasn't finished. The trauma of the past weeks lingered in Sophie's tense shoulders and haunted eyes. She still flinched when the phone rang, still checked every shadow when she walked outside. Healing, Ethan knew, wouldn't come with a single verdict. It would come in the slow, quiet moments that followed. He invited Sophie and her daughters to continue staying in his Malibu guest house as long as they needed. On their first morning of peace, he found Sophie on the patio at sunrise, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the waves. She looked both fragile and strong, like someone who had been broken and then carefully pieced back together. He sat down beside her, handing her a warm mug of tea. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he said gently. She turned to him, eyes glistening. "It's not that simple," she whispered. "Fear doesn't just leave because someone tells it to." He nodded, understanding more than he could say. "But every day you get up, every time you take a breath without looking over your shoulder, it gets weaker." They sat in silence, the only sounds the crashing surf and the distant calls of seagulls. It was the kind of silence that felt comforting, not empty, a sign of something healing rather than something lost. Sophie's daughters began to laugh again. Their giggles filled the sunlit rooms as they played games, their little feet pounding across the wooden floors. Ethan watched them with quiet joy, remembering his own childhood days filled with fear instead of laughter. He vowed they would never have to feel that again. He taught them how to make pancakes poorly, at first burning the edges until the girls howled with laughter. Slowly, the house filled with a warmth he hadn't realized was missing from his life. With Ethan's support, Sophie accepted a job at a respected legal aid organization, assisting other women in situations like hers. It was a job she took to heart, driven by the knowledge of what it felt like to stand alone and powerless. She poured herself into the work, learning new skills, discovering her own strengths, and building something she could call hers. The first time she came home late with a stack of case files tucked under her arm, Ethan greeted her with a proud smile. "You look like someone changing the world," he teased softly. At night, after the girls were tucked in, they would sit side by side on the porch. They talked about their days, their hopes, the small victories that felt like miracles. Sometimes they sat without speaking at all, letting the ocean's rhythm fill the spaces between words. It was in those quiet moments that something unspoken blossomed between them, a bond formed not of necessity but of choice. It was the way Sophie reached for Ethan's hand without hesitation, the way he watched her with unwavering respect, the way they moved around each other with ease, like two people who had learned the value of patience and trust. One evening, as twilight settled over the coast, Sophie stood watching her daughters chase each other in the yard, their laughter ringing out like bells. She turned to Ethan with tears in her eyes. "I never thought we'd be okay again," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I thought the fear would swallow me forever." He stepped closer, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "The fear doesn't go away overnight," he said softly. "But it loses its power when you remember you're not alone." They found peace not in dramatic gestures but in the small, quiet things, shared breakfasts, bedtime stories, the way Sophie's daughters began calling him when they were scared or excited. Ethan realized that every time he heard their little voices calling his name, it felt like coming home. There were no promises made under grand chandeliers or sunsets. There was just the steady choice to keep showing up day after day. Ethan thought often of the lesson this journey had carved into his heart. True strength isn't found in power or money. It's in standing beside someone when the world tries to push them down. It's in lifting someone up until they can stand on their own again. And it's an understanding that healing isn't about forgetting what broke you. It's about growing beyond it. When Sophie finally moved into a small apartment of her own, the girls decorated it with drawings of their new family. One morning, the youngest handed Ethan a picture stick figures of all 6 of them, holding hands under a bright yellow sun. Above it, in shaky letters, it read, "Family Forever." His eyes stung as he read the words, the truth of them settling into his soul. He realized then that love wasn't something you fell into. It was something you chose over and over every single day. And as he watched Sophie laugh with her daughters as he helped set the table for dinner in their cozy new home, he knew they had all chosen each other. Because in the end, peace wasn't something the court could give them. It was something they had fought for together. And that made it worth every tear, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt. Because now, at last, they were free. Ethan Carter never imagined a routine trip to the courthouse would lead him to a family that would forever change his life. He walked in that morning focused only on closing a deal, but what he found instead were 4 hungry little girls waiting in silence for a mother who was fighting a battle she never should have faced alone. Sophie Morales, a hard-working single mother, stood accused by a powerful man who thought he could break her spirit and walk away untouched. Through courage, compassion, and an unyielding pursuit of the truth, Ethan helped Sophie reclaim her voice, protect her daughters, and expose the lies that threatened to destroy them. Alongside Martha Collins and Derek Vaughn, he uncovered a pattern of abuse stretching far beyond Sophie's case, revealing the dark side of unchecked power and privilege. This wasn't just a story of a millionaire rescuing a struggling mother. It was a story of 2 people finding strength in each other, of a woman who transformed her pain into purpose, and of a man who rediscovered what it meant to care about something more than success. Together, they proved that justice isn't reserved for those with wealth, but can be achieved when people stand together against injustice. They showed how even the quietest courage can ripple outwards, inspiring others to speak up, reach out, and believe in a world where the truth matters. Their journey wasn't easy. Fear tried to break them. Lies tried to silence them. But each time darkness closed in, they fought back with kindness, patience, and unwavering support for one another. Ethan learned that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought in boardrooms or courtrooms, but in the quiet, everyday moments where we choose to show up for each other. Sophie learned that her worth wasn't defined by what she had lost, but by the love she gave and the strength she carried, even when no one was watching. From this story, we can draw a powerful moral. Real strength comes not from dominance, but from compassion. Not from vengeance, but from patience and understanding. Life will test us with people who try to use their power to belittle or control. But by staying true to our values, standing by those who are vulnerable, and believing that even small acts of kindness can change the course of someone's life, we build a better world for ourselves and those who come after us. It reminds us to never turn away when we see someone in need, and to never underestimate how much a helping hand can mean to someone who feels forgotten. In your own life, remember the power of listening, of choosing empathy over judgment, of giving others the grace you would hope for if you were in their place. Whether it's offering support to a neighbor going through hard times, standing up for a coworker facing injustice, or simply teaching your children the value of kindness, each of us can be the light someone else needs. Thank you so much for watching and spending your time with us today. If this story touched your heart or inspired you, please don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to our channel. Your support gives us the motivation to keep bringing you more true stories of resilience, love, and courage. We're grateful to have you here with us.